Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I've been feeling a touch nostalgic. I've been talking about Ellen White's book a lot, and if you haven't been following that series, she was one of the primary founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the first two videos I ever made for this channel were both responding to a Seventh-day Adventist channel, Bible Flockbox. Also, for reasons that are completely unfathomable to me, that second video is still my most viewed video on my channel. It's garbage. Don't watch it. Watch my second most viewed video instead, which is also a response to Bible Flockbox. Anyway, Ellen made me think of him, and apparently y'all love it when I respond to him, because even when I make a really bad video about it, it becomes the most viewed video on my channel. So I decided to see what he's been up to recently. And as it turns out, one of his most recent videos is him defending the prophecies of Ellen White. And no, that's not what you're watching today. Reading her shit directly is bad enough. We don't need to see his take on her stuff. So instead, I'm responding to his video that asks the question, should Christians support Pride Month? And without spoiling too much, I will just say that it is both exactly what I expected it to be, and I was pleasantly surprised. I know those two things sound contradictory, but I'll explain when it comes up. Let's go!
Pride Month is here. Every June in the United States is set aside for Pride Month to commemorate the Stonewall riots and to celebrate the LGBT+ community and raise awareness for ongoing struggles, equal rights, and acceptance of LGBTs.
This is part of the pleasantly surprised aspect of the video. He gets the details essentially correct and even manages to avoid portraying the LGBTQ community in a negative light. Mostly. His tone at the beginning there was a bit questionable, but we can look past that. The Stonewall riots happened in June of 1969 in Greenwich Village, after a police squad called the Public Morals Squad raided a gay bar, the Stonewall Inn, which involved them lining up the patrons of the bar, having them present their ID, and check the pants of anyone dressed as a woman to make sure that it wasn't a man dressed as a woman, because apparently cross-dressing was illegal back then. Anyone who was cross-dressing would be arrested. The male police officers sexually assaulted a number of women during frisking, and the police used violence when trying to restrain people. This drew a crowd of sympathetic onlookers, which eventually turned violent, resulting in the police being trapped inside the bar. Police reinforcements eventually arrived, and they cleared the streets. On the second night, more rioting ensued, but this time it became clear that the public was on the side of the LGBTQ community, or at least a good chunk of it was. As described by one witness, it seemed like an overnight change, where it went from going places where you had to knock on a door and speak to someone through a peephole in order to get in, we were just out. We were in the streets. So this marks one of the first times in American history when LGBTQ people went out in public without trying to hide themselves. And it was the event that gave the gay liberation movement the momentum it needed to get off the ground. Gay rights groups popped up in every major American city within 2 years, and the first gay pride marches happened in Chicago, LA, New York, and San Francisco on the anniversary of the riots in June of 1970. None of this history is specifically relevant to this video, but a surprisingly large proportion of the population know very little, if anything, about the Stonewall riots, so I figured I'd do my part with a very brief summary here.
How should Christians react to this? Should we endorse Pride Month or should we condemn Pride Month? And if so, how?
Have you tried minding your own fucking business? Ask your doctor if minding your own fucking business is right for you. If you are going to be anti-LGBTQ, then yeah, minding your own fucking business is probably the best option for everyone involved.
Okay, so the idea about equal rights and acceptance of members of the LGBT+ community is one that Christians should endorse. Equal rights refers to the idea that all people should be treated equally and have the same opportunities and protections under the law, which includes members of the LGBT+ community. There are several Bible verses that endorse this. For example, Leviticus chapter 19 verse 15 states, "You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." In other words, everyone should be treated equally. This includes people living an LGBT+ lifestyle. For instance, how would you like to be discriminated against for being a Christian? It happens every day all over the world. In some countries, Christians are marginalized, persecuted, and even killed for their faith. And just because somebody is living a lifestyle that you or I don't approve of doesn't mean that we have the right to mistreat them.
And there we go, the second part of the pleasantly surprised aspect of the video. Christians should love and accept LGBTQ people and support them in their fight for equal rights. If this were where he ended the video, it would probably be the best video on his channel. But the fact that you're seeing it on my channel should be a pretty big hint as to what kind of turn he's about to take.
With that being said, should Christians endorse the LGBT plus lifestyle? No, the Bible is clear that is a sin.
And so begins the exactly what I expected it to be portion of the video. Sigh.
For example, Leviticus chapter 18 verse 22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." This applies both to gay and lesbian relationships.
Huh, that's interesting. If it applies to lesbians, then if we read it as written, that means that they should not lie with a man as they would with a woman. So there you have it, by your own admission, lesbians are perfectly acceptable. And yes, I know that's not what he's actually saying. He's just trying to say that this verse condemns lesbians as well, despite it not even hinting at their existence. In fact, as I've observed in previous videos, I do find it interesting that there is no explicit condemnation of any form of lesbian sex in the Old Testament. It wasn't until the practice of having multiple wives had come to be frowned upon when we see the first condemnations of girl-on-girl sex. That always seemed a little bit sus to me, to say the least. But, I mean, hey, if we're reading the Bible through a modern lens and pretending that it is instructing us on how to live our lives and saying that women should also be reading the Bible, then when a woman reads this verse, it is clearly instructing her to not have sex with a man. So Leviticus 18:22, if we assume it applies equally to everyone who might be reading it, means that the only sex that God allows is in fact lesbian sex.
And the word abomination means something especially offensive to God. The reason being is because their sexual behavior contradicts God's will.
Which then leaves us wondering, why is an omnipotent being concerned about what we do in the bedroom? And why did God design mammals to exhibit same-sex sexual behaviors if he finds that to be an abomination? Such behavior has been observed in at least 261 mammalian species. Does God get angry at gorillas being gay? If not, why not? I'm sure the Christian answer to this will be something about humans being made in God's image, but I'm also sure that most Christians would agree that, even if we pretend that humans are not just a kind of ape, we are much closer to being beings like the other animals than we are to being God. So this would be like if I were to get angry at ants for certain sexual behaviors that they exhibit, but not termites. It seems rather arbitrary. In fact, pretty much all of the rules in the Bible seem arbitrary. Occasionally you do get one or two that seem designed to uphold aspects of morality that we might agree with in the modern day, like not murdering, and sometimes there are some health concerns, like the kosher diet is said to protect people who hold to it from dangerous foodborne illness by forbidding the consumption of food that's more likely to be contaminated, like pork and shellfish. But when you look at other aspects of the Mosaic Law, it just seems completely random. Don't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk, for instance. Is it okay to cook it in the milk of a goat that's not its mother? If so, what's the difference there? If not, then is there an inherent problem with cooking meat in milk? And it would have to be a problem that is specific to goat meat. What about the rule against planting a field with more than one kind of seed? There can be an issue with decreasing yield if you plant multiple crops in the same place that have nutritional needs that are very similar, but the inverse is also true. If you plant a nitrogen-fixing crop alongside a crop that requires a lot of nitrogen, then you'll get better yields than if you plant either of those crops alone. So this seems to not only be an arbitrary rule, but a counterproductive one that has likely led to at least a few starvation deaths over the years, which could have been prevented if God had instead provided his people with one of those handy-dandy companion planting charts, explaining which crops are beneficial to plant together. Hell, if you're one of those Christians who likes to cherry-pick Bible verses to find scientific facts in the Bible that weren't knowable to people at the time, then one wonders why God provided Mesoamerican civilizations with the knowledge of companion planting, while strictly outlawing it for those who are supposed to be his chosen people. Because the Mesoamerican societies were using companion planting agricultural methods well before the time when the Bible was written. All this to say, the Bible says a lot of things that modern Christians completely ignore for one reason or another.
The Bible says a lot of things. Shove her!
Its stance against homosexual relationships could just be another one of those things that they ignore, but a lot of them choose not to. Which leads me to the conclusion that such Christians are not just following what the Bible says, as they claim, but they are bigots and are using the Bible to shield themselves from facing the full social repercussions of their bigotry.
From the beginning, God created man and woman in his image and instituted marriage as a union between the two, and commanded them to procreate.
Yeah, but in that whole "therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife" thing, there isn't an instruction for how marriage is meant to be. It's just explaining the origin of marriage. And it's a bit of a nonsensical one, if I'm honest. Eve was made out of Adam's rib. Therefore, the descendants will leave their parents when they get married? How does any of that follow? Does Adam want his rib back, and so it's built into men to want to live with a woman because he misses that rib? Is the act of sex, becoming one flesh, supposed to fulfill Adam's desire to have a full rack of ribs? And more importantly, is that why it's called boning?
Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it.'"
You're going with that one. Okay, well, see, that one's not even commanding marriage, just lots of sex and lots of babies. And at a world population of about 8 billion people and counting, with natural environments giving way to urban sprawl and plenty of animals being endangered directly because of loss of habitat to human expansion, I think we fulfilled that command. Hell, I'd even go so far as to say we exceeded expectations on that one. If you want to find a way to fit LGBTQ people into a Christian framework, then maybe God started making gay people as a message to us to say, okay guys, that's enough babies, you don't need to keep the population growing at this point, and holy fuck, there's a bunch of extra unwanted babies too. Let's have some loving couples that would gladly take in those unwanted babies and raise them as their own. So there you go. Gay marriage is God's message for us to cut it out with the population growth already, and to let gay couples adopt kids. I mean, LGBTQ people have existed for as long as people have existed, but if you have to ignore that and pretend that it's a relatively modern phenomenon in order to accept them, then I guess go for it.
Same-sex unions contradict this plan, and they are harmful as well.
Well, that plan has been fulfilled, so it's no longer necessary, and contrary to what you just said, same-sex unions have been shown to be beneficial. In fact, the legalization of same-sex unions not only has a positive effect on the mental health of the couples who get married, but across the board for everyone in the LGBTQ community. On top of that, social stigma also seems to be the main driving force for risky behaviors that lead to an increased risk of other health problems like STI rates. Specific to parental rejection, LGBTQ adults who reported that their parents rejected them were more than 3 times more likely to report engaging in risky behaviors like drug use and unprotected sex than their counterparts who were accepted by their parents. The more research I do into this subject, the more it seems that close to 100% of the problems that are specifically faced by LGBTQ people can be solved, or at the very least significantly mitigated, by education and family and community acceptance.
For example, gay men are at higher risk of STDs and AIDS.
Yes, this is true. And part of the reason that this is true is because STIs spread more easily through anal sex than vaginal sex, regardless of the genders of people having it. This can be mitigated through safe sex practices like condom use, and education about those safe sex practices and the risks involved in not making use of those practices. Now, if society treats homosexuality as something that is wrong and goes against God's plans for them, do you think that people promoting such a worldview will be amenable to the types of sex education that would specifically be aimed at reducing the elevated risk of STIs in gay men? Probably not, and that is why social stigma exacerbates the situation, at least part of the reason. So if you actually care about LGBTQ people, as you pointed out at the beginning of your video that Jesus says you're supposed to, then heaping more stigma on them by saying that their relationships go against the will of God is not the way to go. Social acceptance would help, though, and God should have known that when he supposedly inspired the Bible to be written. So add this to the list of reasons why we know that the God of the Bible doesn't exist.
An online post entitled STD Facts: What Gay, Bisexual, and Other Men Who Have Sex with Men Need to Know About Sexually Transmitted Diseases states, while anyone who has sex can get an STD, sexually active gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, MSM, are at greater risk. In addition to having higher rates of syphilis, more than half of all new HIV infections occur among MSM.
Yeah, why don't you read that whole section for us? Why are you cutting it off there? because the bit that you read was literally the introduction to a bulleted list of factors that contribute to the higher STI rates in men who have sex with men. The third bullet point is homophobia, stigma, and discrimination can negatively influence the health of gay and bisexual men. So right there on the page that you are reading from is where it explains that one of the primary causes of this increased risk is people like you doing things like making videos like you are making. Congrats, you're a part of the problem.
And practicing anal sex is harmful. An online post entitled "What You Don't Know About Anal Sex," a gastroenterologist explains, states, "What is the association between anal sex and fecal incontinence?" The authors found that receiving anal sex results in a 34% increased risk of fecal incontinence in women and a 119% increased risk of fecal incontinence in men. For the purposes of the study, fecal incontinence was defined as a leakage of liquid or solid stool or mucus at least monthly.
And then he stops reading the article after getting those scary sounding numbers out there, making you think that tickling your prostate will basically guarantee that you poop your pants when you're older, especially if you're a man. But as we learned from the last point, he does like to cut things off before providing some necessary context, so let's read the next sentence in the article, shall we? Keep in mind these figures are relative risks, meaning that the absolute increases are only 2.5% in women and 6.3% in men. And in the interest of fairness, I'll continue on to Dr. Gandolfo's editorializing in the final sentence of this paragraph. That being said, I would submit that any increased risk of fecal incontinence is a risk that is just not worth taking. Which is his subjective opinion based on his personal preferences as a straight man. Well, I mean, he's probably straight. I haven't seen a public post about his sexuality, and I haven't really dug that far, but it's also fine because, like, there's no need for patients to know the sexuality of their doctors. But going from him posting a picture of him with his wife and kids, straight is a pretty safe bet here. Now, there's nothing wrong with his opinion. He's perfectly entitled to it, and he can have no anal sex if he likes. But for a gay man, that might be considered a perfectly acceptable increase in risk in exchange for the extra bonding that that type of sex could add to the relationship. Like, if we want to find something comparable, there is zero risk of an unwanted pregnancy with gay sex, and any heterosexual vaginal sex does come with such a risk. Even for me, after having a vasectomy, it is very rare but not impossible for the vas deferens to spontaneously heal. A gay or lesbian couple might look at that and say, any increased risk of an unwanted pregnancy is just not worth taking. And honestly, with abortion access being what it is in the States, there's a lot of places where an unwanted pregnancy will result in an unplanned child. And I'd rather have to deal with fecal incontinence when I'm older than to bring a new life into the world that was not wanted. So the risk of heterosexual vaginal sex potentially comes with a significantly worse consequence than any anal sex. And all of that is without even getting into the fact that there's way more to gay sex than just anal penetration. So it's even possible to be gay, have an active sex life, and never have anal sex. And on top of that, if we're going to be using the prevalence of STIs as an excuse to say it's not okay for men to be gay, then you should be perfectly fine with lesbians, since out of all the sexual behavior combinations, women who exclusively have sex with other women have the lowest STI rates. And I'd be willing to bet that they have a lot less anal sex than the other groups as well, though I don't have data backing that one up. So, sexually speaking, the strict lesbians are the safest group to be in, and with my earlier interpretation of Leviticus 18:22, it actually seems to be the group that's commanded by God. So, yeah, all this to say that Christians should stop using health as an excuse to deny LGBTQ people equal rights, because if you actually apply that argument equally across the board, straight marriages should also be outlawed. The only acceptable marriages should be lesbian ones.
Look, I know this may not be a comfortable topic to talk about. I don't like talking about it either, but I have to let you know the dangers.
No, you really don't. You could just, mind your own goddamn business and not contribute to the social stigma that leads to a lack of proper sex ed, which in turn exacerbates the dangers that you were supposedly warning about. You're warning about these dangers without providing the necessary context as to why these dangers even exist, exaggerating the extent of these dangers, and not explaining how they can be mitigated is literally a huge part of the problem that causes these dangers in the first place. If you actually felt it was your duty to warn people because you cared about keeping them safe, you would have provided the additional context that you actually had to go out of your way to not provide.
Also, gay and lesbian relationships are detrimental to society.
Again, that is just factually not true. But more importantly than that, Remember at the beginning of the video when you said that Christians should endorse equal rights and acceptance of the LGBTQ community? Would you feel accepted if there were a very large segment of the population that regularly made content calling your relationship with your wife unhealthy, against God's will, and detrimental to society? Or would you feel like such content would make you feel marginalized? So how about you take your own advice and shove this part of your video up your ass so that nobody can ever see it, since you won't explore the male G-spot for risk of incontinence?
Imagine what would happen if everyone became gay or lesbian today.
Asking what would happen if every single person in a society did the exact same thing is not how you determine whether or not that thing is detrimental to society. Imagine if every single person in society became a professional YouTuber today. Society would collapse because we need people to do other jobs in order to maintain society. The YouTubers themselves rely on such people in order to get their content out to the world. So naturally, I guess, professional YouTubers are detrimental to society. Now, I could actually see an argument that professional YouTubers are a net negative on society, as YouTube seems intent on rewarding lazy, lowest common denominator content over content that actually takes thought and effort, but that's a discussion for another time. Right now, we're just evaluating whether or not something counts as detrimental if everyone adopting it would cause the collapse of society. And really, that could apply to anything. If everybody became a medical doctor, society would collapse. If everybody became a general contractor, society would collapse. It doesn't matter what it is. The fact is that not everybody will become the same thing, because humans are diverse and have a diverse set of interests, skills, and abilities. And while you could argue that this isn't really comparable because jobs are not sexual orientations, because, you don't choose your sexual orientation, but you can choose your jobs, I'd argue that the comparison is still valid because while you do choose your job, to a certain extent at least, I'm not going to get into the whole cascade of socioeconomic conditions that lead to some people having a greater degree of choice in career than a lot of other people. That could be its own hour-long video on its own, so we're just going to set that aside. So ignoring that aspect of jobs, you choose your job based on your interests, education level, and skill level, but you do not choose your interests, and there are factors outside of your control that can have a significant impact on your education and skill levels. By the same token, it could be said that you do choose your partner, but your choice of partner will be limited by things that are outside of your control, like your sexual orientation. So while these are definitely not even close to perfect analogs for each other, for the purpose of determining whether or not society would collapse if everybody became like you, either in employment or sexuality, it's close enough.
How long do you think humanity would survive? Not very long, because gay and lesbian relationships can't reproduce children.
So what? Aside from the fact that we are in no danger of having 100% of the population turn gay and lesbian anytime soon, do we really measure the validity of a relationship by its ability to produce children? What about heterosexual couples that are infertile? And on the flip side, what about lesbian couples where one of the women is trans, or gay couples where one of the men is trans? Those relationships are capable of producing children, so are they valid? Are they okay with your God? There is so much more to a romantic relationship than the production of crotch goblins, and to reduce such an integral part of the human experience to that one aspect is to completely ignore the majority of the human experience.
What about transgenderism? A lot of people are talking about that today, and, well, biblically, your sex and your gender are the same.
Well, actually, biblically, the Bible never mentions trans people. It doesn't even so much as hint at the existence of trans people. So accepting trans people should be easier for Christians than accepting lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, because there aren't even any verses that have to be reinterpreted or pussyfooted around in order to accept them, because there are 0 verses condemning them. In fact, since modern Christians seem obsessed with lumping Judaism into their worldview by calling it the Judeo-Christian worldview, it bears mentioning that there are 8 recognized genders in the Talmud. And apologies in advance for mispronouncing these, but I'm going to list them. Zachar is male, Necheva is female, androgynos, having both male and female characteristics, Tumtum, my favorite of the names, is lacking sexual characteristics. Elonit Hama is identified female at birth but later naturally developing male characteristics. Elionit Adam is identified female at birth but later developing male characteristics through human intervention. Saris Hama is identified male at birth but later naturally developing female characteristics. And Saris Adam is identified male at birth and later developing female characteristics through human intervention. Rabbinic tradition also holds that Adam was created as the androgynos gender. After all, Genesis 1:27 says that God created man, male and female. So when God made woman out of Adam's rib, that was God removing the female portion of Adam and splitting him off into 2 people, the man and the woman. So not only is there no condemnation of trans people in the Bible, but rabbinic tradition identifies a total of 8 genders. The closest the Bible ever comes to condemning trans people is the command against cross-dressing in Deuteronomy 22:5. But it doesn't take anywhere near the amount of squirming to interpret this in a trans-friendly way as interpreting Leviticus in a gay-friendly way does. Men shouldn't wear women's clothes. Women shouldn't wear men's clothes. Trans men are men, so they shouldn't wear women's clothes. Trans women are women, so they shouldn't wear men's clothes. Easy peasy.
If you're born with male anatomy, you're a male, and vice versa. There's nothing in the Bible to indicate otherwise.
There's also not anything in the Bible that indicates that that is actually the case. At most, the Bible is silent on the issue. But given the rabbinic tradition of acknowledging the existence of trans people, I'd say it actually comes closer to affirming their existence than denying it. But you wouldn't know that from how modern Christians behave.
Biology confirms this. Female DNA typically has 2 X chromosomes, while male DNA typically has 1 X and 1 Y chromosome.
Your use of the word typically there kinda invalidates what you're attempting to say. Because if you say that chromosomes are what determines someone's sex, and their gender has to align with their chromosomes, then there are a lot of people out there with vaginas, uteruses, eggs, boobs, and everything that would wind up being categorized as male by such reductionism, and vice versa. Sexual determination is a very complicated process, and even slight variations in the process can produce people who don't fit neatly into the male or female boxes if you insist on the narrow definitions of male and female that are usually insisted upon by people who like to deny the existence of trans people. Hell, they can't even agree on a definition amongst themselves. Some will insist it's the chromosomes that are the defining feature, others will insist it's the gametes, while still others will insist it's based on your reproductive anatomy. And unfortunately for all of them, no matter which of these definitions you choose, there will be exceptions to the rule, which makes the distribution of human sex bimodal rather than binary, with most people fitting pretty well into one of the 2 categories on either end of the spectrum, but with there being several people on various points in the middle of the spectrum. In the case of chromosomes, even ignoring the whole XX equals female and XY equals male thing, there are people with XXY chromosomes, XYY, XXX, and even people who have some cells in their body with XX chromosomes and others with XY chromosomes. And this is not even an exhaustive list of all the possibilities. As soon as you recognize that there is an exception to the binary, it doesn't matter how few in number those people are, and it doesn't matter if it's technically categorized as a developmental disorder, the fact remains that it is an exception. And in a binary system, there are no exceptions by definition.
No matter how much makeup you put on or how many surgeries you get, you can't change that.
Nobody is claiming that makeup and surgeries change chromosomes. Future Rhino cutting in. Since recording this, I've come across a 2017 study that shows that there are genes common to most mammals, including humans, that are actually responsible for maintaining gonadal sex in adulthood. In other words, in mice, researchers have shown that the mutation of a single gene will result in an adult mouse changing their gonadal sex, and there's no reason that this would not hold true for other mammals, like humans, as well. So yeah, putting on makeup won't change your sex, but your sex is hardly this immutable rock that you seem to think it is. But I also don't change how I interact with people based on their chromosomal makeup, so that's rather irrelevant. Do you demand to see a genetic test from everyone before agreeing to use their preferred pronouns? Or do you just largely let the social interactions happen without thinking about their DNA? If you demand genetic testing, then I got news for you. You're a superficial asshole. And not the kind of asshole that can be fun to play with, thus justifying a slight increase in risk of future incontinence. The kind that is never clean and can be smelt a mile away.
So you are always biologically the gender that you were born.
Well, an argument can certainly be made that gender identity has its basis in biology, and as such could be said to be an aspect of biological sex. To conflate gender and biological sex is a mistake that leads to confusion. To quote Dr. Stephen Novella's excellent article, The Science of Biological Sex, what researchers find when they simply describe gender in the population are people who display pretty much every combination of morphological sex, gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. Gender identity does not appear to be binary at all, and does not even fall into categories as cleanly as sexual orientation. So yeah, how about we don't conflate the 2 concepts? Although, really, to be anti-trans, you kinda have to, otherwise the sex is a binary argument wouldn't even exist. Because if you acknowledge that there's more to sex than just this person has pee-pee and this person has a vajay, then you open the door to more questions about what sex even is, and whether or not a person's gender will always match their primary sex characteristics. And once you open the doors to those questions, the answer is a resounding no, they do not always have to match. And so you're left with the existence of trans people as a fact. And in reality, that is the way of it. So to be anti-trans, you must deny reality and pretend that sex is the only biological trait in all of existence that does not vary in complex and messy ways.
Not to mention, transgenders dress as the opposite sex, which the Bible condemns.
Nope. As I already pointed out, the Bible does not say do not dress in the clothes of the opposite sex. It specifically tells women not to wear men's clothes and men not to wear women's clothes. And if trans men are men and trans women are women, then to tell them to dress in accordance with whatever might be found between their legs is actually going against the biblical command to not cross-dress. But also, cross-dressing is harmless, and which clothes are considered masculine and feminine change over time. Boys of the 1800s were regularly dressed in big, poofy dresses of white and pink, decorated with bows and ribbons. It wasn't until the 1940s that pink started becoming known as a girl color. Before then, pink was seen as a diluted form of red, and red is a masculine color. Red is about passion and aggression. Blue is cool and passive. Pink is diluted red. Boys are basically diluted men, so men wear red, boys wear pink. And in reality, in the 1800s, dyes were expensive and prone to fading, so generally kids of either sex would wear white. But when they were wearing colors, it was actually pretty evenly distributed which colors went on which kids. It wasn't until the early 1900s in the States when companies started trying to sell more kids' clothes by separating them by gender, and at that point it became the classic pink for boys and blue for girls. That only gradually began to change in the 1930s, with it finally being fully switched in the 40s and 50s. And today, pink is coming back into fashion among men, with shirt makers reporting an uptick in their production of men's shirts in pink, an increase in the sales of pink ties, and so on. I've been wearing more pink myself recently to let my partner's kids see that it's okay to wear pink, because they both really like pink, but have been taught by certain parties who shall remain nameless that pink is only for girls, so I've been setting the example rather than just telling them that it's okay. And honestly, I kinda wanna not wear pink anymore because I saw my neighbor, who is the quintessential example of toxic masculinity, wearing a pink shirt that is almost identical to one of mine, and the idea that I have anything in common with that douchebag is distasteful, to say the least. So, given the fluid nature of clothing and what is considered masculine and what is considered feminine, the command for men to wear men's clothing and women to wear women's clothing just seems completely arbitrary, even aside from the existence of trans people.
In addition, LGBT plus people suffer higher rates of mental disorders, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, most of which is caused by a phenomenon known as minority stress, which happens when a minority, like LGBTQ people, are stigmatized by people in the majority. You cause the exact problems that LGBTQ people face by stigmatizing them, then use the existence of these problems to justify your stigmatization of them. It's gross.
And this can be a result of the prejudice and discrimination they face, along with the fear and stress of concealing their identity.
Oh, so you're not ignorant of that fact, you know it. You acknowledge that you and people like you making content like this are a huge part of the problem. And yet you continue to contribute to that problem after opening the video by saying that they deserve equal rights and acceptance. You can fuck all the way off with your pretending to care bullshit. The fact that you know that you are part of the problem and persist in being a part of that problem demonstrates pretty conclusively that you don't actually care. And that's it for this one. He just spends the rest of it telling Christians to stay away from pride marches while acknowledging that the LGBTQ community has every right to hold such marches. So if he hadn't just finished demonstrating his awareness of the fact that him making content like this contributes to the high rate of mental illness in the LGBTQ community, I might say that he went back into pleasantly surprised territory, but instead I'm just left feeling sickened at the fact that he figured out that he is directly contributing to harming people that he claims to care about and decided to hit publish on this video anyway. Today's comment of the day comes to us from a fresher cadaver, because talking about fecal incontinence earlier wasn't gross enough, so we had to go for cadavers as well, who says, if you have to rely on a news aggregator, then you probably shouldn't follow the news. This is regarding my ground news ad on my last video, and while they aren't paying me to suck their dick in this video, I do honestly love what they do, and I frequently use them for twit tweets. They get this one for free, I guess. But honestly, I don't see why someone would be against a news aggregator. Like, really, in my experience, a lot of people seem to use Twitter as a pseudo-news aggregator, and that's problematic at best. Having a third party that collates similar stories so you can see how they're being covered by different outlets is a good thing, even if you don't use the one that I recommend. It makes it harder for you to accidentally echo chamber yourself. I guess I just don't understand why you would think that a tool that makes checking multiple sources to see what aspects of a story might be left out by other outlets would make one unqualified to follow the news at all. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole, and I stream with my partner every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern here. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the fecal incontinence that is caused by the anal sex that is my channel. If you'd like to tickle a prostate, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! The Stonewall riots happened in June of 1969. I mean, it's the nice number, 1969. Higher STI rates in men who have sex with men. There's a typo in the script. I wrote men who have sex with me. They don't have a higher STI rate. I would think they would have a lower STI rate because I don't have an STI.